with that said, everyone, I want to talk about a Taiwan update, okay? And so the United States, of course, I don't think I've been on since Ed Markey's Senate delegation. So Ed Markey took 4 other Congress people. This guy's a fraud. He's always been a fraud. So-called progressive Ed Markey took 4 other Congress members to Taiwan recently, just 12 days after Nancy Pelosi's trip. So that was August 14th. And of course, they did the same thing as Nancy Pelosi. They met with stakeholders. They met with Tsai Ing-wen, the so-called president of Taiwan Authority. So after that happened, an announcement happened from the trade representative of the United States, Catherine Tai, and I want to read what they said, because this is about economics. Of course, war is always about economics. War is not just for some kind of abstract domination. The economic realm is the principal contradiction under imperialism, because imperialism is outgrowth of capitalism. So on August 17th, after this trip, the United States announced formal negotiations on a U.S.-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade. Under the auspices of the American Institute in Taiwan, which is the fraudulent, so-called informal embassy, the informal embassy, because you're not allowed to have a U.S. embassy in Taiwan because it's not a country, but nonetheless, that's what the American Institute of Taiwan is. In the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States have reached a consensus on negotiating mandate for the U.S.-Taiwan Initiative on 21st century trade, announced on June 1st, 2022. The negotiating mandate announced today sets out broad objectives of the two-sided upcoming trade negotiations. It's expected that the first round of negotiations will take place this fall. Today, we begin negotiations with Taiwan under the auspices, blah, 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 for innovation, yada, yada, yada. So the Deputy United States Representative Sarah Bianchi said, "We plan to pursue an ambitious schedule for achieving high standard commitments and meaningful outcomes, covering the 11 trade areas, negotiating a mandate that will help build a fairer, more prosperous, and resilient 21st century economy." So that's not informal cooperation. That is literally attempting state-to-state economic relations with China's sovereign territory. So, of course, China is not happy about this. And there's a big reason why it's not happy about this that we're going to get into. I want to first share with you an article about China's response to these ambitious plans. Beijing reacts. So RT says a senior Chinese official accused Taiwan of colluding with external forces. It said that a spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office, Miao Xiaogang, responded to an American statement on trade talks what Taipei issued earlier this week, saying, quote, "We urge the U.S. to abide by the One China principle and the 3 Sino-U.S. joint communiques with concrete actions. Attempts to play the Taiwan card to prevent China's reunification and national rejuvenation will not succeed." Adding that Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party had colluded with external forces, betrayed the interests of the people on the island, and sought political self-interest. And it came less than 24 hours after the Office of Trade Representative released a document outlining an ambitious roadmap for the talks and that they were going to begin this fall. So here's what the United States really wants out of this. And I'm just going to talk about this. Because not only do you have the military escalations from direct violations of the One China policy, but you have something interesting economically happening. Ed Markey's delegation, Nancy Pelosi's trip, these trips to Taiwan all had the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TMSC, which produces the bulk of the entire semiconductor industry that exists in the world. They all met with this huge giant, right? And the whole point is this, and it's going to be disastrous for Taiwan, and it's not going to work out the way I think the United States hopes it will. But what the United States wants out of Taiwan is this, and this will be the principal ask in these negotiations, because I put that in quotes because Taiwan is essentially being cultivated as a neocolonial puppet regime within a within a territory that is not a country. So that's very complicated. But in a sense, the United States is playing with fire and attempting a neocolonial arrangement in something that I think is unprecedented, right? Violating another country's territorial integrity and sovereignty in the process. But I want to just mention that the big ask for Taiwan is for it to move its manufacturing, move its both its manufacturing hub. It wants Taiwan to export that manufacturing to the United States, to come up with arrangements that allows for some level of outsourcing to the US, which, if you've seen inflation these days, you can sense that that might be a disaster. But that's why the CHIPS Act was passed, for all these subsidies. So what the United States is going to say is, we have these subsidies. Do you want to cash in, come and try to produce in the United States, and stop trading with China, stop uh, doing business in China? Because China also has favorable terms for companies, Taiwan production, to do business in China, right? So that's often not talked about a lot. You probably remember Foxconn. That's a Taiwan-based corporation. They did a lot of production in China, where there was the controversies about working conditions during that period, the early 2000s. Now a lot of things have changed. Standards are higher. Labor laws enforced better now over the years in China. But nonetheless, still a lot of production happens, right? There's a big trade relationship that China has with Taiwan, and it's so robust that it includes production. And so the US is going to ask Taiwan, wink, wink, ask, right? It's going to say, no, we have these subsidies now. We have this CHIPS Act. We want you to cut that off. We want to isolate China. And it's also probably going to incorporate, as it's not a coincidence that South Korea, Japan, and other countries have been included on these trips, right? Because they're all going to try to coordinate. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, uh, uh, they're all going to try to make these countries coordinate a way to cut off China from this industry, to basically strangle it with an economic noose. It's not going to work because, one, China's market is so important to these countries, Taiwan not being a country, but it's so important to Taiwan and these other countries that it would be suicidal to try this. Now, I'm not saying that the DPP won't do something dumb. I think the DPP is the most likely to make a very rash move economically in these negotiations, and China will bear down consequences for this, of course, because this is a violation of sovereignty. But Japan, South Korea, some of these other countries, I think, are going to have a harder time negotiating this economic encirclement to complement the military encirclement of China, because China's market is so diverse. China's trade relationships with South Korea, Japan, and others in the region, right? It is the biggest trade partner of all of Asia, and these countries especially. China can bear down consequences, and it would be well within its right, because this is not, quote unquote, fair competition. This is militarizing the economic realm. This is economic imperialism. It's about strangling China economically so that it cannot advance its production objectives, its economic goals. It's all about containing and weakening China. So that is what we can expect this fall, if and when the Taiwan Authority meets with the trade representative and other stakeholders of Washington, to start to outline what this economic partnership, this new economic partnership for the 21st century, is going to look like. It's really just another instance of war. I mean, that's the big update, though. That is what's happening. And it's not like we can expect that somehow this is going to replace the military side of this. I think that the Biden administration, the Democrats, are going to continue to escalate with China on that realm as well, because there's a midterm elections coming up in less than 3 months. November's right around the corner, and they're going to want to solidify, the Democrats, their anti-China, tough on China stance. So even just that immediate concern alone should uh, help us understand that things are likely to continue to escalate unless there's pressure for them not to. But we just don't have that right now. We don't have a lot of people out on the street saying no war with China, right? And that's the big problem that we face. We face a problem with this propaganda, these imperialists, ventures being normalized and sanitized to the point that people don't really understand what's going on. Either they don't find it important or they literally think that what their government is telling them and what their corporate media is telling them is true. But of course, we know that this is all lies, that the United States is trying to create a neo colony within China, Taiwan, and use Taiwan to both launch a military uh, operation within its new Cold War, the pivot to Asia, the encirclement of China, etc. That's been happening since 2012. And now economically, right, stripping Taiwan of its Chinese market, right, of its mainland Chinese market. That's what is going to happen. And it very well could create, it's going to create shockwaves to Taiwan because China has already toughened its stance, economic stance toward Taiwan. But the CHIPS Act is going to ask for outsourcing and may lead to actually a weakening of Taiwan's economy because the United States is not a trustworthy partner. It's going to ask this company, the TMSC, to cash out, which means it will lose a lot. I mean, what has outsourcing done in the United States? It's made things more precarious for people. And whenever there's an increase of precarity under capitalism, there's also an increasing risk of economic crisis, right? Those two things go together. The more that workers struggle, the more that people struggle economically under capitalism, the more that capitalism builds the conditions for economic crisis. And so that's likely to happen in Taiwan once this CHIPS Act, these negotiations, this shift occurs. It's hard to know how fast it will occur, though, because of these consequences. The United States cannot afford Taiwan being placed in economic crisis because that's going to make the Taiwan Authority, I mean, that alone will make it understand that it needs the mainland market, it needs the mainland economy. So that's going to strengthen one China. And on the other hand, the United States can't be made to look like a fool before elections or even right after elections. Can't be made to look like a fool when it very well knows that despite these subsidies, the United States is not going to invest heavily in production in the United States. That's a pipe dream. That's not even a dream. That's just a lie. US investors, I've been saying this on every single program that I've been on talking about this issue. US investors have for decades not wanted to invest in production. And why is that? Because not only do you need more than just these government subsidies, which they pocket, they pocket government subsidies for their own shareholders, bondholders, etc. But you not only need government investment, which goes antithetical to their plans for austerity, but then the corporations themselves, in the absence of the government investment, now need to place a whole lot of capital on the table to jumpstart production. That's how production works. You need to put down the costs that it takes. You can't the buildings, the machinery, all that stuff doesn't pay for itself, right? You need to get that from somewhere.